You know all those boomers who complain that the quality of discourse has been going down like a rock? Well, they're right. They're not usually correct for the right reasons, but they're right nonetheless. The quality of discourse, and of discussion in particular, has been going down quite a lot since the dawn of the new century. Now, it would take me at least 5 hours to barely scratch the surface as to why and how this happened, but what's the point? I mean, heck, even I don't care why, even though I kinda know why and can explain it, but it's a waste of time. The point is that it happened. Okay, it happened, now what? Well, if only we could fix one or two of the most common discussion sins, that would raise the quality of the discourse quite a lot, and it's not even hard. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so the inspiration for this video was born last year while I was in Germany and having lengthy conversations with a long-time fan of this channel, and he gave the name for one of the issues due to be presented. What I mean by discussion sins is techniques used oftentimes completely unintentionally to frame or forward a discussion. These techniques end up ruining any discussion and routinely steering it away, not just into off-topic territory, but in full potato territory and the there be dragons territory. So in this video, we'll talk about just two of the major ones in the hope that this will help you spot them both in others and in yourself. Because we all fall prey to sin from time to time. The question is how one addresses that when it happens. And the first step is to at least acknowledge that it exists. Because oftentimes in the current year, we're led to believe that such thing as a discussion sin, or indeed sin in general, doesn't even exist. Now, keep in mind that a discussion sin is not just a logical fallacy. Although logical fallacies are routinely part of a discussion sin, the two are not congruent. Not all logical fallacies are discussion sins, and not all discussion sins are logical fallacies. So, without further ado, let's get to the first one: ex parte deduction. Now, what I mean by that is when one of the parties involved in a discussion makes a judgment and a logical deduction about all the other parties involved without notifying anyone and without even inquiring further to see if the process by which they made that deduction is indeed logical. Ex parte, as many of you may know, is a legal term from Latin which quite literally means on behalf of, or more liberally, in the name of. This issue is now almost universally pervasive. There are essentially no political camps that don't practice this at some level. However, when it becomes a discussion sin is when the deduction becomes part of the argument for another issue rather than the argument itself. For instance, leftists routinely argue that conservatives, or really anyone to the right of Mao Zedong, is a racist. Now, this is a dumb argument, but just because it's dumb, it doesn't mean it's illegitimate. Are conservatives racists? Well, some are. Most aren't, though. Arguing on whether conservatives are racists or not is not in itself a discussion sin. It's a dumb argument, but it's an argument one can nevertheless make or have. However, when it becomes a discussion sin is when its conclusion is rendered without an argument, and then that conclusion is used to further a different argument. In other words, an ex parte deduction. When you put it like that, it sounds complicated, but it's really easy. Open up almost any article from the New York Times, a former newspaper, especially the opinion section. More than 2/3 of their articles that deal specifically with politics don't even try to make an argument, be it dumb or not, on whether conservatives are racists or not. They start straight up with the ex parte deduction and then work from there. And that is a discussion sin. Not only is it unfair, heavily biased, and, dare I say, libelous, but it ruins the conversation before it even starts. If your premise is based on something no other party even began to argue, let alone believe, and if your premise is based on a conclusion for which not only the argument did not take place, but a conclusion with which almost nobody agrees, the direction of the discussion necessarily becomes one of full potato. Perpetual discourse meaninglessness, basically. Now, the right does some of that too. There are quite a few individuals out there who regard anyone to the left of Augusto Pinochet as being basically a commie. Now that's terrible because it poisons the well and does not forward any discussion. Now, although, with that being said, the right has worked a lot to avoid this particular sin, at least when compared to its past. I mean, in the 1950s, some elements of the right regarded even classical liberals as basically commies. In fact, the John Birch Society called liberals closet commie traitors, even though the society itself had liberals and Democrats in its ranks, and some of those Democrats even made it to be the president of the John Birch Society. So, compared to those times, the right is now in much better shape in avoiding or eschewing this particular discussion sin. Here's another argument. Almost any argument from the left allegedly meant to deal with or talk about those of us who are skeptical of the totalitarian international socialist project being sold alongside with the environmental program. This at first used to be political operative talk, but now it's the standard even for people who should know better. The giveaway is the use of the term climate change denier, a class of people that quite literally doesn't exist. A climate change denier should be a person who believes that the climate on this planet has been exactly the same for the last 4.2 billion years. Nobody believes that. Even young Earth creationists still have to believe that the climate changed a few times in the last 6,000 years, or whatever the age of the Earth they think it is this week. I mean, it's in the Bible that God changed the climate a few times, and surely Bible literalists are the first to internalize that, right? Isn't it so? So who's left? So, no reasonable people, no Bible literalists, so who's left? Well, nobody. Because climate change deniers do not exist in reality. Climate change deniers are a rhetorical construct, a piece of fiction if you want, and the result of an ex parte deduction. The deduction is simple. These people don't believe we should overhaul our economy, society, way of life, traditions, and well-being? Well, therefore, they must be denying science. Now, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's literally the thought process of an ex parte deduction. And it's easy to notice it too. Have a chat with a climate change alarmist and start like this. Look, of course climate changes from time to time. At some point the whole planet was covered with ice. And 1 million years ago, there was more CO2 in the atmosphere than what our civilization could do in emissions if we were 500 billion people on the planet. The question is not whether climate changes or not. Of course it does. The question is whether this time around is something really so serious as you make it. Evidence suggests it's quite far from it, by the way. Even the boomer IPCC is slowly grasping with that reality. And the second question is whether any of your policies would improve the situation even 1 iota. And on the second question, I believe you're entirely wrong. Paying more to the government will not change the weather. And then, if you want to have real fun, ask them what they know about the year without winter. That would be 1816. And what they know about this nice concept called minimum solaris. What is their understanding about volcanoes? And then ask them to square that circle by claiming your car or your plastic straw is what's ruining the winter, or the climate overall, or anything really. You will notice that the vast majority of them will be lost somewhere after the first sentence. The best of them will be lost after the second sentence. So the ex parte deduction not only harms the discussion overall, but it harms the leftists' ability to argue as well. And overall, it harms most people's ability to think. In essence, the ex parte deduction is a shortcut to avoid nuanced thinking and indeed thinking itself. And the second discussion sin I want to present to you is a much broader one, which is in many ways it is the root of most meaningless arguments in politics, and it is, as Sam called it back in Germany, the sin of assuming shit. It's such a good name that I had to nationalize it. And because of this name, this list only has 2 elements rather than 10, because most of the other things that I would have wanted to talk about in this video can ultimately be categorized as the sin of assuming shit. So, instead of 10 elements, you get 2, but the second one with many examples to illustrate as many facets of this sin, of assuming shit, which in my opinion is the sin we could all do very well without. In short, the sin of assuming shit is when a conversation starts with the opening that everyone who is due to answer already knows just as much as the conversation starter, already agrees with almost everything that the conversation starter agrees with, and perhaps the worst, already subscribes to the same prescriptions and priorities. The last one is the most horrific of all and leads to the most virulent discussions. Now, occasionally that's a very good thing, but more often than not it leads to a lot of angry people shouting at each other. Here's an example. 3 billionaires have more wealth than half of America. The best way to test whether you're dealing with someone who is assuming shit is to reply with, okay, so what? If the answer comes with a long-winded shrieking, that person is assuming shit. Assumes that you have the same priorities as them, assumes that you subscribe to the same values as them, and in this particular case, assumes that you are at least as misinformed as they are. Because the factoid that 3 billionaires have more wealth than half of America includes in that allegedly oppressed half of the population, well, it includes people like, let's say, Jeff Bezos' son, or his younger son, whose net worth is, legally speaking, 0. It also includes all the other children in America. It also includes 100% of the prisoners, and with the few exceptions of genius, very young billionaires, it also really includes the whole population between the ages of 0 and 24, which is already about 32 to 33% of the US population. That number of the alleged oppressed half also includes almost every disabled person in America, which is further 19% of the population. And suddenly we're roughly there at about half of the population. And yes, you don't need a PhD in grievance studies to know that able-bodied older adults tend to be richer than disabled adults, criminal adults, and children. Now, once one becomes informed about these things, one becomes smarter and stops using irrelevant factoids to forward a discussion. It's one thing to want to discuss income inequality, and a whole other thing to assume everyone else is just as misinformed as really most people wanting to discuss income inequality to begin with. Now, noticing when someone is assuming shit is useful in multiple ways. If you're not dealing with a bad faith actor, pointing it out is a good way to take the conversation to a much deeper and serious level. If you're dealing with a bad faith actor, pointing out is a good way to persuade the audience that your case is better, or at the very least that the interlocutor is insane, or judgmental, or just plain dumb. For instance, in the academe, the understanding of the sin of assuming shit since 2014 and onwards has given rise to solid research that is now slowly being used everywhere to dismantle anti-white programs, commonly known as diversity and inclusion programs. The research is so solid that heavily biased publications and experienced political operatives for the left have started to panic and produce a lot more nuanced arguments lately, because they have also figured it out that enough people saw right through the initial pitch. In fact, the vast majority of the arguments for diversity are essentially a manifestation of the sin of assuming shit. The shit being assumed here is that diversity is not just inherently good, but also desirable. But what if it isn't? Diversity is surely not good for companies, academic research solidly established multiple times throughout the past decade. None of these conversations would have happened if nobody had called out the sin of assuming shit in diversity advocates. Or even better, if diversity advocates had come with a better case and not engaged in the sin of assuming shit right from the get-go, we would have all been in a better place. This is an example of bad faith actors. Most of the proponents of diversity know very well, or at the very least sensed it, that diversity in itself cannot be inherently good. Sure, it can be good sometimes, it sure as hell can be bad sometimes, but most of the time forced or mandated diversity is just institutionalized bigotry by a different name, and really nothing more. And the pitch is almost always emotional and based on the assumption that everyone else's priority is the breaking of homogeneity. The problem is that that's far from reality. Have you ever asked everyone else whether they're concerned with the same thing? Maybe they're not. The sin of assuming shit could have been very well observed during the 15 and 16 migrant crisis, when almost every pundit out there outright assumed that not only Europe has a duty to more than half of the world, but that most of the electorate also subscribed to that view, or at the very least gave a damn. Subsequent election results offered a much more mixed picture, the electorate basically saying, well, you know what, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. Now, it could be because it is a little bit more complicated than that, and most of the much-needed discussion still hasn't taken place properly, though I suspect it will throughout the 20s because it has to. And we will know once the discussion has turned away from full potato land and into the realm of reason, once we will see the more reasonable questions being openly asked. And what are some of those questions? Well, here's a few. Number 1. Why should people in Turku, Pilvișchii, Jacobeni, Villefranche-sur-le-Mer or Przemysl give a damn about the plight of Nigerians, Syrians or Pakistanis? What exactly is their duty for that? These are small and far from rich towns in Finland, Lithuania, Romania, France and Poland respectively, for those not exactly fond of European geography. But nevertheless, this is a serious question. Most of the case for opening the borders is based on assuming shit. Specifically, assuming that most of Europe is like Berlin, London, Paris, Rome or Amsterdam. But it isn't. Pilvișchii, Lithuania, and Turku, Finland, have a lot more in common than any of them have with Helsinki or Amsterdam. 2. Another reasonable question. What exactly is so bad in Europeans wanting to preserve their national character of their country that isn't identically bad in Ugandans or Ethiopians striving for the same thing? 3. If striving to preserve the national character of your country is so terrible, then where can I donate to send you to preach that message in Ramallah, Sana'a, Pyongyang, Tunis or Mbabane? According to research, these are some of the least ethnically diverse places on Earth. So if that's so bad, how about we start from where the problem is at its worst? 4. If economic growth and/or economic sustainability is the issue for which we need more people, then wouldn't that equally be well served by baking more Europeans? We all know the process on how to do that, don't we? Basically, one has to cut through the nonsense, and this can happen much faster if the sin of assuming shit is quashed. It's not complicated, really. It really isn't. Now, the sin of assuming shit doesn't necessarily have to be political in intent. It can be very casual and not inherently political in motivation. For instance, when I tell people that I don't have any debt, I don't use smartphones ever at all for any reasons, and other than that, what I post here, I never post pictures with myself, let alone my girlfriend, or really anything that is private and none of the business of the general public. That routinely comes with an assumption that I must be living in a tent somewhere in the woods. Now, that is also assuming shit. And while regular people who do this are very likely not acting in bad faith, they're still guilty for allowing themselves to be misinformed, and oftentimes intentionally so. Again, not necessarily with bad intentions, but disinformation nonetheless, whether it's subtle or not. The idea that you can't function without debt is not just slight misinformation, it's outright bollocks. Yet millions of people, mostly young, almost all Western, seriously believe it. Unsurprisingly, they're also some of the poorest bunch in their societies. I don't know, there might be a correlation somewhere. It could be that, ideas have consequences, sure. But perhaps the most harmful example of assuming shit is whenever you're criticizing something. The immediate assumption being is that you hate that particular something. The version of the sin of assuming shit is almost universal at this point, this particular version. It transcends politics by quite a margin. I don't know yet whether it's the product of terrible upbringing or even some personality disorders, or just the inevitable result of democratizing information combined with the general truth that people are not stupid, people are fucking stupid. I suspect it's a combination of all of these and even some other factors that, I haven't considered yet. In any event, the assumption that you're a hater every time you criticize something is almost everywhere. Check out my videos about BitChute. I criticize BitChute all the time, and I do it because I want them to succeed. I pay for membership there, and I feature this particular nice BitChute cup in almost every video, and have been doing so ever since they finally bothered to send me the first one out of the 3 cups that they owe me. So it's hardly the case that I hate them. If I had hated them, I wouldn't be giving them my business, just like I do with all of the other companies and businesses and corporations that I despise. Yet nevertheless, I get accused of being a hater because I say that their service oftentimes sucks and that they must improve if they want success, not to mention that I want the value for the shekels paid. Same goes with when I criticize anything, really. The very concept that one can criticize something without hating necessarily that something, or indeed while actually appreciating it, has now been entirely tossed out on the window. And the sin of assuming shit has everything to do with this. Mention anything bad about immigrants? You're a racist. Mention anything bad about transgenders? You want to gas them all. Mention any skepticism towards so-called sex education? You must be a Bible thumper. Works with some on the right too, especially of the more reactionary variety. Try telling reactionaries that monarchies are terrible both historically and in present day, monarchies being by far the most dysfunctional countries in the world. I mean, after all, Sweden is a monarchy, so is the United Kingdom, and so is Qatar. Now, mention any of that to monarchists and you'll immediately be called a commie, at the very least. As I said, the sin of assuming shit is not exclusive to the left or to the right, but in modern times it has much more harmful effects coming from the left. After all, we can all live a very happy life, even if 2 to 5% of the right wing may think we're commies because we're not very excited about the idea of a monarchy, which makes them assume we're commies because of that. However, it is increasingly less the case that we can live a happy life when 95% of the left wing, alongside with the cucked right, whose numbers are anyone's guess, and the force of the law, they all three think we're evil and dangerous because we're skeptical of the narrative that, let's say, men can become women. So yeah, the sin of assuming shit can have pretty serious consequences once a manifestation of it carries the force of the law. The good news is that it's a sin easy to diffuse when you're dealing with reasonable people. Diffuse it in enough of those and the power of unreasonable people will shrink considerably. The success of many of these clown world type of narratives heavily relies on the ability, and in this case the inability, of regular people to spot common discussion sins, particularly the sin of assuming shit. The success of far-left politics in the past was predicted on this deep understanding of human nature. As I said, the sin of assuming shit is not exclusive to the left. And the recent and increasing success of non-leftist politics is, at least in part, owed to the increasing knowledge and wisdom in non-leftist political operatives to spot and or to use these sins in reverse. Ultimately, understanding the common discussion sins is useful in all contexts, not just for politics. It prevents unnecessary conflict, it prevents unnecessary animus, and it helps further reason and decency rather than, well, emotion and indecency. So yeah. Well, I guess that's pretty much all I had to say. Do tell me in the comments if you think I'm exaggerating or if you know other discussion sins that don't fall into the category of ex parte deduction or assuming shit. It seems to me that these two are broad enough to encompass most, but surely I must have missed something, maybe. So yeah, and with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support. Don't forget to visit our website, send me to the gulag, please. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.